Hello, everyone. How's everyone doing today? Good. Okay. Okay. Cool. 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 Thank you so much for this opportunity to be able to speak to you all. I am extremely excited about this topic, and it has been such an honor to be able to do this research. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and all right, remembering the enslaved at the Tuleyries. And as I mentioned, or as Santish mentioned, I am Antonio Austin. I am the summer 2020 intern. I'm the historical archive creation intern, and I hope that you will learn something. And I hope that you find some of this research that I've been doing quite interesting. One of the things that I would love to say just to start out is that kind of trigger warning, like we are going to be talking about slavery, we're going to be talking about the enslaved, and I understand that that is it's an emotional topic, and it can be very laborious to speak about. So I do want to give that little bit of a warning. So I'm very, very excited, like I said, to speak with you all, remembering the enslaved at the Tuleyries. So I wanted to make sure for those that may not be familiar with the area, I wanted to show you all the Tuleyries. This is I believe, a greeting card, photo card from around 1907 or prior, thanks to the Historical Association, Clark County Historical Association, which had this image. So I thought that, to find an older image would be really, really cool to kind of see what things look like prior to, of course, today. So with any presentation, I always love to give an overview, because sometimes when people are talking, it's just like you just hear a lot of facts and everything, and you don't know kind of where you are and where you're going. So I want to make sure that I give an overview. So we're going to talk a little bit about me. We're going to talk about the slave cemetery and quarters, research approach, barriers, the Tuley family, documents, the Colbert family, interesting facts, and future and continuing research, along with your questions. And I really, really do hope that you all ask me questions, because I really want to be able to engage with you all tonight. So about me, my name, as I mentioned, like for the third time, I'm W. Antonio Austin. I am from a small town called Pittsboro, which is about 15 miles outside of Chapel Hill, North Carolina. That is where I grew up. And for me, as mentioned before, I went to Elon University, where I pursued my bachelor's degree, got that in 2014. I continued on to Valdosta State University in Georgia, where I got my degree in education, master's of education and educational leadership. So I actually worked in higher education for quite a bit. And now I am at the illustrious Howard University. I am pursuing my PhD, majoring in United States history with a minor in public history. And some of the other images that I haven't spoken yet about excuse me, Young Black Genie, which is it is a creation of mine, and it is a blog where I try to show a lot of different intersections in my family and be able to relay some of those oral traditions that have been passed down, along with the traditional research that I've done. And I also wanted to show Tom Taylor, who is this person that is in this photo to the left. He's my third great grandfather, and one of the earliest ancestors that I learned about as early as the fourth grade. And yeah, so I am, like I said, want to just give a little bit about me, so you can kind of, know who I am. History, of course, isn't something that I've always done, but I've definitely had an interest in history for almost all of my life. I've done genealogy for over half of my life, and that's really what got me into history and wanting to pursue this program, and of course, which ultimately led me to this opportunity. So the slave quarters and slave cemetery, one thing that I want to mention is terminology, because words are powerful. And what I will say is that you will see that I refer to what people would say as slaves as enslaved. And the reason why I do that is because the enslaved were more than just slaves. They were made slaves by other people. They're enslavers, but they were also husbands, they were wives, they were nieces, nephews, children, mothers, fathers, etc. And we don't want to demean their experience or their lives to just one facet of their experience in their lives. So what I will say is, for inanimate objects like the quarters and the cemetery, I will say slave quarters, slave cemetery, or cemetery for the enslaved, just as an FYI. So this picture on the left is the fenced off area, which is where the cemetery is located. I took that about a couple of days ago, so it was a nice bright day, so I got a pretty good picture. So there was a survey, a radar survey that was conducted in 2021. And there were roughly 40 to 42 disturbances that were located, which means about 40 to 42 burials that have happened there. The cemetery was referred to in an old plat around 1905 as the old slave burial ground. So when Blandy actually had its first director, he actually was aware of this, because you see some of these large trees, they are not in that area. So that is something that's interesting to know. And to the right, and we're not really going to focus much on the cemetery, only because there are some discrepancies regarding when the cemetery was actually purchased, because there, as far as I've seen, there hasn't been references to a cemetery in deed records. So it could be the fact that some of the people I have researched are not even mentioned, that I have mentioned or researched are not even buried here. And so I want to make sure that we're focusing more so on the quarters, which is where we know was a barrack style slave quarters for the enslaved at the Tuleyries estate. So this was, as I mentioned, barrack style, two levels with a front entrance that no longer exists today. And this is a view from the back of the structure, which was likely taken in the early 1920s. So my research approach, very, very similar to genealogy. I was starting from the present or a particular event and working backwards. Specifically, I started with the 1860 estate record for the death of Colonel Joseph Tuley, which I will go into later, utilizing online resources, digital databases, and search engines. So that's Family Search, Ancestry, Heritage Quest, even Google. Google can give you some gifts, I'm telling you, but also online resources. That is where so much of the information is stored, especially some of that like juicy information that, are in the court cases and stuff like that. It's on site, whether it be courthouses, libraries, or other types of repositories, but also people. Of course, there's no one alive now that knew the enslaved here at the property. However, oral tradition is something that is very strong, especially when it's passed on. So speaking to people can help put things in perspective. And one of the things that I have sought to do in this project is centering the experiences of those enslaved. That also could be a barrier as well, because of the fact that these people were considered property. So I want you to realize that, we can't really think with our 2020 like mind frames. We have to think of, how things were in the 19th century. And barriers in my research, as I said, researching the enslaved, that can be a struggle at times because they are not seen as people. They are seen as property. So in a lot of records, they're listed between the books, they're listed between the livestock. There's not necessarily, there are resources. However, it's challenging. It can definitely be a challenge. And also some of the information missing from records, that is a big thing as well. And a lack of family documents so far, because I haven't really been able to come across many documents from the Tuley family in particular. So we're going to start with the Tuley family and related families, which include Brownley, Mitchell, Strother, Wright, and Boyce. So we have Joseph and Nancy, or she's referred to sometimes, Anne Brownley Tuley. Joseph and Joseph in particular was from New Jersey. I'm not quite sure what actually brought him to Virginia. However, what I do know and what's well known is that he had a trade. He was a tanner, meaning he tanned leather, and he operated a mill in Millwood that was close, right next door to the mill that was owned by Nathaniel Burwell. He also, I believe, owned another mill, smaller mill in White Post as well. Nancy was the daughter of John and Elizabeth, or known as Betsy Brownley, who resided in Frederick County, Virginia. Also very important to note that when doing this research, I was going back and forth to Frederick and Clark County courthouses because Clark County was actually formed out of Frederick County in 1836. So records prior to that are going to be housed with Frederick County or with the Library of Virginia. So you see here, Joseph and Anne married in 1787 and had 4 children that are, I found a decent amount of information on. Mary Tuley, who married Henry Mitchell, Sarah Tuley, Major Uriel Wright was her husband, Belinda Tuley, who was married to Charles Strother, and Colonel Joseph Tuley Jr., who married Mary Wheeler Edelin Jackson, actually, because she was married prior. One thing that I do want to note is the fact that I will refer to Joseph Tuley, the father, as Joseph Tuley, and the son as Colonel Tuley, because it can be very confusing when it comes to those 2 names. So as, I'm not sure if I mentioned this before, but one of the first documents that I actually read was a proceeding that was published by Clark County Historical Association from the late 40s, early 50s, which talked about the large manor homes in Clark County, which a lot of times mention the families that owned this property, but also the structure, information about the land, and even some of the transcripts of will and estate information. That was very helpful in my research and was really great to kind of get me started. But however, one of the things that I'm glad that I did was actually pull those original documents, because for for Colonel Tuley, the son, when the transcript was listed in this proceedings, it just had the number of enslaved people at the end. It didn't list any names, any ages, nothing like that. However, that proved to be wrong, which I was very happy about. So these are portraits of Colonel Joseph and Mary W.E.J. Tuley. So Colonel Joseph Tuley married Mary Wheeler Edelin Jackson in Washington, D.C. on the 20th of April, 1835. So he was actually the person who constructed the Tuleyries, which was a part of around, 850-acre estate located in Frederick County, which is, of course, now Clark County. It's important to note that this land in which he lived on had been priorly owned by his father, and the estate or the house known at that time was called the Grove, which is why my research doesn't just specifically focus on the enslaved that Colonel Tuley enslaved. So Colonel Tuley, this was his first marriage. Mary Tuley was married to a Dr. James Jackson prior to their nuptials and was the mother of 3 children. One of the interesting facts that I found out about Mrs. Tuley was that she actually was someone that was quite well revered. They revered her for her beauty, for her intellect. She was known to be invited and attended several parties by several of the presidents. So she was someone that people definitely knew and was kind of like a socialite. So this is an important timeline, and this timeline is of Colonel and Mrs. Tuley, if I can get my notes together. This timeline is June 1860 is when Colonel Tuley unexpectedly dies. And I say that he unexpectedly dies because he's only about 64 years old. And I realized that people didn't live that old then, but he also didn't have a will. And that is kind of, I would say, uncommon, especially for someone that had so much property. So he died intestate. August 1860, there was an appraisement done by a group of community members who were sent to create an inventory and to appraise his property, his property. Yeah, sorry about that. October, there was advertising regarding the estate sale. The 15th of October, 1860, Mary Tuley actually sold her dower rights to the heirs, which would have been his sisters, as they did not have any children. Late October through early November 1860 is when we have the estate sale. So just to kind of bring this up to now, this, like I said, happened, of course, 1860. His appraisement was for $64,857.24, which is approximately $1,896,158.07 in 2020. And their enslaved would have been roughly around $755,045.67. So when Mary Tuley sold her dower rights, it was equivalent to today's money and about $350,830.48. So this was a lot of money. And I really say that to really establish that, you know, this wasn't a farm, this was a plantation. Like these people had amassed a decent amount of wealth. So these are some of the sales advertisements. This in particular was from the Alexandria Gazette, the 25th of October, 1860. And these ads are literally sitting on top of each other. So one is, the one on the left is from Mary Tuley. The one on the right is from Joseph T. Mitchell, which would have been her nephew, Colonel's nephew, Joseph Tuley Mitchell. A lot of them are named Joseph Tuley or something Tuley. And it's interesting because Mary doesn't mention any enslaved people being sold. However, Mitchell says, I will also sell at the same time and place 63 Negroes comprising mechanics, house carpenters, and farm hands, an unusually likely young and valuable lot of Negroes, seldom offered for sale in any community. So these discrepancies were a little scandalous, to say the least, but it was very, very interesting when it comes to my research. As of right now, I'm not quite sure what happened to the enslaved between 1861 and 1865. But we go to the appraisement and inventory. This was the, this is the document that I didn't realize existed, because in that, that book, essentially, it said that there were just a number of enslaved people given. So I was very amazed and so elated when I found that people were named. These enslaved people were named along with ages, even though some of them you can see Jack Birch, 75 to 80, or Jonas the blacksmith from 55 to 60, estimated, but still very, very helpful to this research. And even more so, some of these relationships, like this is amazing. You see in the right hand image, Frankie and Anderson, her son. And then you see also Mahalia, Scott, her son, Lewis, her son, Louisa, Susan, Tom, etc. I want you to keep that name in the back of your head, because that's going to pop up later. So this is a continued list. And like I mentioned before, it also includes the names, the relationships, and the ages, and also the value. And so it's just very, very sad. I was talking to the REU students prior, and someone had asked about how do you kind of reconcile and deal with the fact that, you know, me identifying as a Black man and also a descendant of the enslaved, like, how do you deal with, you know, going through a lot of these sources? And it's hard, especially when you see things like this, where it says Charlotte, about 72 or 73 years old, worth $1. And some of these records I've even come across where it said these older enslaved people were worth nothing. And it's just, you know, it's heartbreaking to, you know, see that, especially these people that, you know, were made to serve other people to not be worth anything. So going on to another part of the estate record was hiring out. So the hiring of slaves, which happened November the 8th, 1860. So what I noticed when I first saw this were that the actual like prices, the values were very, very low. And so I was kind of confused until I realized that they were only renting these enslaved people, I assume right after the sale up until December 31st. So for about, I would say maybe 6 to 7 weeks of work. So you see those prices, $2, $1.50, etc. But you also see who the people are that were hiring them out, which was also really great. But then you see, which makes sense because I assume that it's probably very, very cold here. During November, there's not a lot to harvest and stuff. So you see a lot of the enslaved people that actually have no bid. And then we'll see the next hiring list. Something that was even more interesting was that it said the slaves that were not hired and put up to the lowest bidder to support and give them the usual winter clothing. So what I gather from this is the fact that this happened either that same day or later, where these individuals were just basically given. They just had to show that they could provide the necessities, clothing, etc., but the work basically being for free. You see that J.T. Mitchell, which stands for Joseph T. Mitchell, who was, like I said, one of the nephews and also an agent for the heirs. He purchased a decent amount of these enslaved people for hire. So some of the data that I found specifically through the census had a decent amount of information regarding the numbers. So in 1860, there were 56 people with 5 slave quarters, or 5 structures in particular. Of course, those don't exist today. The only one that exists is the quarters, or part of what we know now as the quarters. 1850, you have 65 people. Now, what I want to pause and say about this part is that in this particular slave schedule, so the slave schedules were kind of an addendum to the decennial census that was taken every 10 years, specifically for 1850 and 1860. They noted that about a third of those that were listed were mulatto. And mulatto, for those that may not know, is typically a trace of European ancestry. 1860, everybody was listed as Black, but that also, kind of raises the question, where did that come from? Where did that European ancestry come from? Is it something that was from, this family? Was it from adjoining families, from overseers? Something that we may not ever know. 1840 listed as having 43 enslaved people. 45 people are involved with agriculture, 5 in manufacture and trade. And something to note with 1810 to 1840, the enslaved people and the free people of the household are listed in categories. So it would be, for example, free males under 10 years old, free white females 10 years and younger, or slave male under 10 years old. So it was in categories like that. So the largest group in 1840 was males from 24 to 35, which there were 15 individuals in that category. 1830, we see 53 people. The largest age group was males under 10, where there was 11. 1820, 45 was the number of enslaved people. The largest group was females under 14, 9. And it lists that 12 people are engaged in agriculture, 7 in manufacturing or manufacture. What I can assume, especially because Colonel Tuley also continued his father's business of the tannery, is that more likely than not, there were some enslaved people that were trade persons in that atmosphere, in the tannery. So that is what I would assume, especially since some of the censuses did not list at all people. And of course, children, a lot of times up until a certain age, did not necessarily have, work, quote unquote. But it's still, it kind of pans out there must have been people doing other trades outside of just farming. So going back to Joseph Tuley Sr. and Nancy Brownley, as I mentioned before, he was a tanner by trade, and his primary one was in Millwood. So he inherited money through the death of his father. His name was John Brownley, and he also inherited enslaved people from his father-in-law's estate. He bought enslaved people from his son-in-law's estate, Henry Mitchell, that died around 1824. And he also, he died with a will, which is very helpful, around the year 1825. So one of the things that I did notice is that he acquired his enslaved people prior to 1803. 1803, in the tax list, he was listed as having 8 enslaved people over the age of 16 years old. So Brownley's division. So this is an excerpt. It's from Frederick County, from the deeds, actually, showing how the enslaved were to be separated, or as it mentioned, partitioned. So there was a total of 31 enslaved people, 22 of which were divided into 3 lots. And so Betsy, his wife, of course, she survived her husband, John, and she received her dower rights of around 9 enslaved people. And so the remainder were to be divided upon the Brownleys' sons-in-law along with their son. So Esaias Earl was a son-in-law, his wife was a daughter, Sally. Joseph Tuley, a son-in-law, his wife was Nancy, or Ann, as I mentioned before. And then you have Archibald Brownie, who is a son. So I have kind of blown it up a little bit where he's actually mentioned. So to Joseph Tuley, lot number 2, Nancy, Lucy, Betty, Ben, Phoebe, Phil, and Jack. And something that I found that's not listed right here was that when Betsy died, there was actually a meeting in 1815 at Esaias Earl's house because of him not receiving the same value of a lot that that Joseph Tuley and also Archibald Brownley had received. And so through that, I learned that Tuley received a man named Peter, his wife Tamar, and son Elisha. So going to the death of his son-in-law, Henry Dudley Mitchell, he died around 1824. He had a total of 11 enslaved people, and Joseph Tuley purchased at least 9 of those enslaved people. And this is the sales account. So it shows, one Negro man, Daniel, $171, one Negro boy, George, $185, one Negro boy, Washington, $165. And you see Joseph Tuley, of course. And I was able to differentiate this between his son, because at this point, his son was a major. And so his son actually didn't buy any enslaved people, but he did buy some things from the estate and was listed as Major Joseph Tuley. So these are some of the enslaved people that he acquired from, like I said, the death of his son-in-law. This property, specifically his son-in-law's, was split from 2 counties, so Augusta County and Frederick County. So I was very happy to find this information all in the Frederick County books. Like, that was amazing, not having to make that drive to Augusta County. So we're gonna get to the will of Joseph Tuley Sr. So Mary received a man named Billy Bowen, Tamar and child, Rose and her child, Frank. Belinda was to receive Cynthia, Julian child, Jeffrey, little Peg, Jacob, and Rachel. Sarah was supposed to receive Bob, Mary and her 4 children, Sarah, Celie and her children. And then Joseph Joseph Tuley was to receive the remainder of the enslaved, along with his father's property once his mother died. And both Nancy and Joseph Tuley died in the same year. So Colonel Tuley received that property relatively early. So something that was extremely helpful, especially because this research can be kind of difficult when people didn't always take the names of their former enslavers, but this is from a deposition from Mary Tuley Jackson, who was the daughter of Mary Mary Tuley, who was the widow of Colonel Joseph Tuley. This was from a case, the Adminstratrix of Colonel Joseph Tuley, et cetera, versus the executor of Mary Mitchell, et cetera. And there were so many people, so many generations listed on this. But this was extremely pivotal and was a gold mine in this research. It says this is a question that was asked to her in her deposition. Please look on the paper marked A in MTT's MJT, sorry, deposition, and say whose slave was Dick mentioned in such paper. She said, Mrs. Tuley's, his name was Dick Colbert. There were two Dicks, but I am certain it was Dick Colbert. When I tell you that, I was very excited to hear because it listed him with the last name. And one of the really interesting things about the enslaved of the Tuleys is that there were a decent amount of them that actually had last names and were referred to on such documents with those last names. So I decided, you know, I know that Dick is a nickname for Richard. So I'm like, okay, well, let's try the 1870 census, the first, you know, census where all people are enslaved, or all people that were formerly enslaved are listed. So what I found, and of course, 1870 census actually does not list the relationships, but typically you can kind of ascertain the relationships for the most part with some families. So you see Richard Colbert listed as 55, Mahalia Colbert listed as 50. That's an interesting name. And they were in Greenway District, so they were still in Clark County, not too far. Their post office was listed as White Post, which is literally like, White Post is behind, essentially, the Tuleyries estate. You see Scott, you see Hugh, Louisa, you see all these different names. And so I was like, this is very coincidental. So what I did was I looked at this 1860 inventory and appraisement, and I noticed Mahalia, 35, an infant, Scott, her son, Louis, Louisa, Susan, Tom. And yes, the ages aren't, you know, of course, they don't match up directly, but these names and some of these children's ages truly do coincide. So you see that she had, she was mentioned in this estate as having 7 children. And a lot of these children are named in this census, which I found to be quite remarkable. So I went on to try to see what I could find about the Colbert family. So I found some marriage records that had been digitized, and I found a James Lewis Colbert who was marrying a Fanny Peterson in 1868. He was supposed to be born in Clark County, and his mother and father are listed as Richard and Mahalia Colbert. I found a Thomas Colbert, same thing. His father and mother listed as Richard and Mahalia. And even Scott, when he died, I want to say, in Millwood. You see he's listed as being born in Clark County, and also that his father's name is Richard Colbert, who was also born in Clark County, Virginia. Now, it's very possible, I can't remember exactly who the informant for death was, but I learned that Mahalia died sometime between 1870 and 1880, because in the 1880 census, Richard had remarried to this younger woman named Hannah. What I also have on the screen is a delayed birth certificate for Willie Colbert, who was the son of Scott Colbert. So one of the things that I really kind of geeked out over is the fact that there is a part at the bottom that says a Bible examined by me, printed in the year 1868, contains an unaltered record of birth, apparently made near the time reading Willie Colbert, born Millwood, Virginia, March 20th, 1876. So my hope is, as this project continues, and hopefully there is a time for connection with some of these descendants, some of this information, some of these oral histories, etc., can help to confirm some of these records that I have found during my research. So I'm going to go into some of my interesting finds that I wanted to just kind of show. So part of Joseph Tuley's will from 1825 says, "I leave Hannah now that now has nursed me in my different spells of sickness, free to all intents and purposes, with $40 to be paid by son Joseph if it should be necessary for her to leave the state." I thought that this was extremely amazing. I was speechless. I did not know what to say. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to find any type of record where she actually was emancipated. I looked for deeds and I didn't find anything, unfortunately. To the right, there's also this slave ad, $100 rewards enticed from the residence of the subscriber near Millwood, Clark County, Virginia. Susanna, a bright mulatto girl about 17 years of age, when spoken to as a down look, as a good seamstress and house servant. She left on the night of the 24th of November last without provocation, and was assisted by some of her friends from Upperville or its neighborhood as she carried a large-sized trunk and traveling bag well stored with clothing. She was probably harbored in that neighborhood. Like, this was a load of information. And the fact that it said that she was property of the late John Carter Esquire and was purchased at the sale of his executors last fall. That is amazing information. And he actually published this around the year 1853, I believe. No, I'm sorry, 1844. Because she, as I mentioned before, like, she wasn't residing at the Tuleyries for a very long time before she made her escape. So she actually was mentioned in 5 different articles, I want to say in January and February of that year. So it was really, really amazing to be able to find this. Something that I also thought was interesting was that the state of Virginia required in around the year 1853 that marriages marriages had been recorded prior, deaths and births to be recorded, and that was to include the enslaved. So this is a register of death from the year 1853, and you should be able to see, let's see, Joseph Tuley, Colonel Tuley, listed right here at the Tuleyries. There was a baby 4 months old and a baby that was a year old that had passed away that year. But this is what I mean about some of the information just not being there, or people didn't really care to actually fill that out, because you see there's nothing there. There's a lot of unknowns. This is another one from the year 1854. One of the years, there was actually a decent amount of people that died from typhoid fever, and it's actually this year. You see several people who are listed. If you follow with my clicker, you can see there were 4 enslaved people that died during that time. Very, very sad, but it shows kind of like what was happening. And also explains the decline of the number of enslaved people as well. And to accompany that, there was also a birth register for the enslaved. So this information was as much as people wanted to give. And to be honest with you, as I mentioned, some people just saw the enslaved as property. If you look at some of these other I can't talk today. Some of these other counties that are mentioned, you see Clark up here, which is Colonel Tuley. But some of these other counties, you see all of this information is filled out. And it's just, there must have been some type of lack of care or lack of reporting, because this information just doesn't really give us much, but a year that some of these enslaved people were born. So there are definitely opportunities for furthering this research. Chancery suits can have very, very vital information. That is how I located the Colberts, and kind of ascertained that connection to the Tuleyries and to the Tuley family. So I wasn't able to utilize the chancery suits from Clark County just because they haven't been digitized. So I just felt like I had to kind of adjust my focus so that I'm able to be productive with the time that I have. And so also locating the descendants of those enslaved, and that could include collecting their oral histories, creating a public database with information, very much like UVA's project that they have going on. That way, if people feel that they may have a connection, they're able to find the information that is known and try to figure out if that connection exists or not. But also mapping out known families in order to find a surname, excuse me. That's something that is extremely important, especially as there is interest in connecting with those descendant communities. Also connecting with repositories, special collections, and manuscript division. I was so happy that I decided to did a simple Google, and I was able to find that Truxton Boyce, who was a descendant of the Tuleys, actually had donated his papers to the University of Delaware. And there is some information, I'm not sure if it's the same information that I have, or it may be some additional information, but those types of, manuscripts and special collections, can be extremely pivotal to this type of research. So I'm definitely hoping that in the future, we're able to capitalize on that. One of the things I wanted to do, like I said, it's very, very powerful when it comes to words. I was always taught that, power of life and death lies in the tongue. But one of the things that I really, really wanted to do at the end of this presentation was to speak the names of those people who were enslaved, because some of these people's names have not been mentioned since they left this earth. And for some of these people, that's coming up on 200 plus years. So I wanted to take the time out to recognize the people that I have discovered along the way: Adelina, Nera, Anderson, Andy, Ananias, Betty, Bill, Brown, Billy, Front Royal, Ben, Nancy, Boatswain, Bob Frost, Bob Plunder, Boren, Seeley, Charles, Charlotte, Cynthia, Daniel, Derry, Dick, Dorcas, Elisha, Elizabeth, Ellen, Emily, Fairfax, Fanny, Felicia, Frank, Daniel, Frankie, Gabriel, George, Armstead, Hannah, Hitty, Jack, Birch, Jacob, Jane, Jeffrey, Jet, Jim, John Armstead, John Bowen, Jonas, Julia, Katie, Laura, Louis, Louisa, Lucy, Lydia, Mahalia, Maria, Martha, Mary, Matt, Molly, Boatswain, Lee, Rachel, Washington, Famer, Peg, Pat, Patsy, Peter, Pleasance, Rachel, Richard, Robert, Rose, Sam, Sarah, Peg, Sepio, Cynthia, Susan, Susanna, Thornton, Tom, Tamar, Warrenton, Winnie, Phil, Sarah, Scott, along with William, Mary, Robert, Thornton, and George. I think that it's just important because these people's names haven't been spoken in years, and there are likely people that descend from them that may never or have never heard of these names or may never know who these people are. But I just want to take the time out to recognize them, because though they've been silenced by history and were seen as property, they are definitely and have always been more than that. And I just want to give them a piece of that humanity back.